The Divine Institutes by Lactantius, Book 1. Now let us proceed to the remaining subjects. The conferring of benefits gave the name of gods to Ceres and Liber. I am able to prove from the sacred writings that wine and grain were used by men before the offspring of Calus and Saturnus. But let us suppose that they were introduced by these. Can it appear to be a greater thing to have collected grain, and having bruised it, to have taught men to make bread, or to have pressed grapes gathered from the vine, and to have made wine, than to have produced and brought forth from the earth grain itself, or the vine? God indeed may have left these things to be drawn out by the ingenuity of man, yet all things must belong to him who gave to man both wisdom to discover and those very things which might be discovered. The arts also are said to have gained immortality for their inventors, as medicine for Aesculapius, the craft of the smith for Vulcan. Therefore let us worship those also who taught the art of the fuller and of the shoemaker. But why is not honor paid to the discoverer of the potter's art? Is it that those rich men despise Samian vessels? There are also other arts, the inventors of which greatly profited the life of man. Why have not temples been assigned to them also? But doubtless it is Minerva who discovered all, and therefore workmen offer prayers to her. Such, then, was the low condition from which Minerva ascended to heaven. Is there truly any reason why anyone should leave the worship of him who created the earth with its living creatures and the heaven with its stars for the adoration of her who taught men to set up the woof? What place does he hold who taught the healing of wounds in the body? Can he be more excellent than him who formed the body itself and the power of sensibility and of life? Finally, did he contrive and bring to light the herbs themselves and the other things in which the healing art consists? But someone will say that this supreme being who made all things, and those also who conferred on men particular benefits, are entitled to their respective worship. First of all, it has never happened that the worshipper of these has also been a worshipper of God, nor can this possibly happen. For if the honor paid to him is shared by others, he altogether ceases to be worshipped, since his religion requires us to believe that he is the one and only God. The excellent poet exclaims that all those who refined life by the invention of arts are in the lower regions, and that even the discoverer himself of such a medicine and art was thrust down by lightning to the Stygian waves, that we may understand how great is the power of the Almighty Father, who can extinguish even gods by his lightnings. But ingenious men perchance thus reasoned with themselves, because God cannot be struck with lightning, it is manifest that the occurrence never took place. Nay, rather, because it did take place, it is manifest that the person in question was a man and not a god. For the falsehood of the poets does not consist in the deed, but in the name. For they feared evil, if, in opposition to the general persuasion, they should acknowledge that which was true. But if this is agreed upon among themselves, that gods were made from men, why then do they not believe the poets, if at any time they describe their banishments and wounds, their deaths and wars and adulteries? From which things it may be understood that they could not possibly become gods, since they were not even good men. And during their life they performed those actions which bring forth everlasting death. I now come to the superstitions peculiar to the Romans, since I have spoken of those which are common. The wolf, the nurse of Romulus, was invested with divine honors, and I could endure this if it had been the animal itself whose figure she bears. Livy relates that there was an image of Larentina, and indeed not of her body, but of her mind and character. For she was the wife of Faustulus, and on account of her prostitution she was called among the shepherds wolf, that is, harlot, from which also the brothel derives its name. The Romans doubtless followed the example of the Athenians in representing her figure. For when a harlot, by name Leaina, had put to death a tyrant among them, Because it was unlawful for the image of a harlot to be placed in the temple, they erected the effigy of the animal whose name she bore. Therefore, as the Athenians erected a monument from the name, so did the Romans from the profession of the person thus honored. A festival was also dedicated to her name, and the Larentinalia were instituted. Nor is she the only harlot whom the Romans worship, but also Faula, who was, as various writes, the paramour of Hercules. Now how great must that immortality be thought which is attained even by harlots? Flora, having obtained great wealth by this practice, made the people her heir, and left a fixed sum of money, from the annual proceeds of which her birthday might be celebrated by public games, which they called Floralia. And because this appeared disgraceful to the Senate, in order that a kind of dignity might be given to a shameful matter, they resolved that an argument should be taken from the name itself. They pretended that she was the goddess who presides over flowers, and that she must be appeased, that the crops, together with the trees or vines, might produce a good and abundant blossom. The poet followed up this idea in his Fasti, and related that there was a nymph, by no means obscure, who was called Chloris, and that on her marriage with Zephyrus she received from her husband as a wedding gift the control over all flowers. These things are spoken with propriety, but to believe them is unbecoming and shameful. And when the truth is in question, ought disguises of this kind to deceive us? Those games, therefore, are celebrated with all wantonness, as is suitable to the memory of a harlot. For besides licentiousness of words, in which all lewdness is poured forth, women are also stripped of their garments at the demand of the people, and then perform the office of mimes, and are detained in the sight of the people with indecent gestures, even to the satiating of unchaste eyes. Tatius consecrated an image of Cloacina, which had been found in the great sewer, and because he did not know whose likeness it was, he gave it a name from the place. Tullus Hostilius fashioned and worshipped fear and pallor. What shall I say respecting him, but that he was worthy of having his gods always at hand, as men commonly wish? The conduct of Marcus Marcellus concerning the consecration of honor and valor differs from this in goodness of the names, but agrees with it in reality. The Senate acted with the same vanity in placing mind among the gods, for if they had possessed any intelligence, they would never have undertaken sacred rites of this kind. Cicero says that Greece undertook a great and bold design in consecrating the images of Cupids and Loves in the gymnasia. It is plain that he flattered Atticus and jested with his friend. For that ought not to have been called a great design, or a design at all, but the abandoned and deplorable wickedness of unchaste men who exposed their children, whom it was their duty to train to an honorable course, to the lust of youth, and wished them to worship gods of profligacy, in those places especially where their naked bodies were exposed to the gaze of their corrupters, and at that age which, through its simplicity and lack of caution, can be enticed and ensnared before it can be on its guard. What wonder if all kinds of profligacy flowed from this nation, among whom vices themselves have the sanction of religion, and are so far from being avoided, that they are even worshipped. And therefore, as though he surpassed the Greeks in prudence, he subjoined to this sentence as follows: Vices ought not to be consecrated, but virtues. But if you admit this, O Marcus Tullius, you do not see that it will come to pass that vices will break in together with virtues, because evil things adhere to those which are good and have greater influence on the minds of men. And if you forbid these to be consecrated, the same Greece will answer you that it worships some gods that it may receive benefits, and others that it may escape injuries. For this is always the excuse of those who regard their evils as gods, as the Romans esteem blight and fever. If, therefore, vices are not to be consecrated, in which I agree with you, neither indeed are virtues, for they have no intelligence or perception of themselves, nor are they to be placed within walls or shrines made of clay, but within the breast, and they are to be enclosed within, lest they should be false if placed without man. Therefore I laugh at that illustrious law of yours which you set forth in these words. But those things on account of which it is given to man to ascend into heaven, I speak of mind, virtue, piety, faith, let there be temples for their praises. But these things cannot be separated from man, for if they are to be honored, they must necessarily be in man himself. But if they are without man, what need is there to honor those things which you do not possess? For it is virtue which is to be honored, and not the image of virtue. And it is to be honored not by any sacrifice or incense or solemn prayer, but only by the will and purpose. For what else is it to honor virtue, but to comprehend it with the mind, and to hold it fast? And as soon as anyone begins to wish for this, he attains it. This is the only honor of virtue, for no other religion and worship is to be held but that of the one God. To what purport is it then, O wisest man, to occupy with superfluous buildings places which may turn out to the service of men? To what purport is it to establish priests for the worship of vain and senseless objects? To what purport to immolate victims? To what purport to bestow such great expenditure on the forming or worshipping of images? The human breast is a stronger and more uncorrupted temple. Let this rather be adorned, let this be filled with the true deities. For they who thus worship the virtues, that is, who pursue the shadows and images of virtues, cannot hold the very things which are true. Therefore, there is no virtue in anyone when vices bear rule. There is no faith when each individual carries off all things for himself. There is no piety when avarice spares neither relatives nor parents, and passion rushes to poison and the sword. No peace, no concord, when wars rage in public and in private enmities prevail even to bloodshed. No chastity, when unbridled lusts contaminate each sex and the whole body in every part. Nor, however, do they cease to worship those things which they flee from and hate. For they worship with incense and the tips of their fingers those things which they ought to have shrunk from with their inmost feelings. And this error is altogether derived from their ignorance of the principal and chief good. When their city was occupied by the Gauls, and the Romans, who were besieged in the capital, had made military engines from the hair of the women, they dedicated a temple to the bold Venus. They do not therefore understand how vain are their religions, even from this very fact that they jeer at them by these follies. They had perhaps learned from the Lacedaemonians to invent for themselves gods from events. For when they were besieging the Messenians, and they, the Messenians, had gone out secretly, escaping the notice of the besiegers, and had hastened to plunder Lacedaemon, they were routed and put to flight by the Spartan women. But the Lacedaemonians, having learned the stratagem of the enemy, followed. The women in arms went out to a distance to meet them, and when they saw that their husbands were preparing themselves for battle, supposing them to be Messenians, they laid bare their persons. But the men, recognizing their wives, and excited to passion by the sight, rushed to promiscuous intercourse, for there was not time for discrimination. In like manner, the youths who had on a former occasion been sent by the same people, having intercourse with the virgins, from whom the Parthenia were born, in memory of this deed erected a temple and statue to armed Venus. And although this originated in a shameful cause, yet it seems better to have consecrated Venus as armed than bald. At the same time, an altar was erected also to Jupiter Pistor, the baker, because he had admonished them in a dream to make all the grain which they had into bread, and throw it into the camp of the enemy. And when this was done, the siege was ended, since the Gauls despaired of being able to reduce the Romans by want. What a derision of religious rites is this! I were a defender of these. What could I complain of so greatly as that the name of gods had come into such contempt as to be mocked by the most disgraceful names? Who would not laugh at the goddess Fornax, or rather that learned men should be occupied with celebrating the Fornicalia? Who can refrain from laughter on hearing of the goddess Muta? They say that she is the goddess from whom the Lares were born, and they call her Lara or Larunda. What advantage can she, who is unable to speak, afford to a worshipper? Caca also is worshipped, who informed Hercules of the theft of his oxen, having obtained immortality through the betrayal of her brother, and Cunina, who protects infants in the cradle and keeps off witchcraft, and Stercutus, who first introduced the method of manuring the land, and Tutinus, before whom brides sit, as an introduction to the marriage rites, and 1,000 other fictions, so that they who regarded these as objects of worship may be said to be more foolish than the Egyptians, who worship certain monstrous and ridiculous images. These, however, have some delineation of form. What shall I say of those who worship a rude and shapeless stone under the name of Terminus? This is he whom Saturnus is said to have swallowed in the place of Jupiter, nor is the honor paid to him undeservedly. For when Tarquinius wished to build the Capitol, and there were the chapels of many gods on that spot, he consulted them by augury whether they would give way to Jupiter, and when the rest gave way, Terminus alone remained. From which circumstance the poet speaks of the immovable stone of the Capitol. Now from this very fact, how great is Jupiter found to be, to whom a stone did not give way, with this confidence perhaps, because it had rescued him from the jaws of his father. Therefore, when the Capitol was built, an aperture was left in the roof above Terminus himself, that since he had not given way, he might enjoy the free heaven. But they did not themselves enjoy this, who imagined that a stone enjoyed it. And therefore they make public supplications to him as to the god who is the guardian of boundaries, and he is not only a stone, but sometimes also a stock. What shall I say of those who worship such objects, unless that they above all others are stones and stocks? We have spoken of the gods themselves who are worshipped. We must now speak a few words respecting their sacrifices and mysteries. Among the people of Cyprus, Teucer sacrificed a human victim to Jupiter and handed down to posterity that sacrifice which was lately abolished by Hadrian when he was emperor. There was a law among the people of Tauris, a fierce and inhuman nation, by which it was ordered that strangers should be sacrificed to Diana, and this sacrifice was practiced through many ages. The Gauls used to appease Jesus and Tutus with human blood. Nor indeed were the Latins free from this cruelty, since Jupiter Latialis is even now worshipped with the offering of human blood. What benefit do they who offer such sacrifices implore from the gods? Or what are such deities able to bestow on the men by whose punishments they are propitiated? But this is not so much a matter of surprise with respect to barbarians, whose religion agrees with their character, but are not our countrymen, who have always claimed for themselves the glory of gentleness and civilization, found to be more inhuman by these sacrilegious rites. For these ought rather to be esteemed impious, who, though they are embellished with the pursuits of liberal training, turn aside from such refinement, than those who, being ignorant and inexperienced, glide into evil practices from their ignorance of those which are good. And yet it is plain that this rite of immolating human victims is ancient, since Saturn was honored in Latium with the same kind of sacrifice. Not indeed that a man was slain at the altar, but that he was thrown from the Milvian bridge into the Tiber. And Varro relates that this was done in accordance with an oracle, of which oracle the last verse is to this effect: "And offer heads to Hades, and to the Father a man." And because this appears ambiguous, both a torch and a man are accustomed to be thrown to him. But it is said that sacrifices of this kind were put an end to by Hercules when he returned from Spain, the custom still continuing that instead of real men, images made from rushes were cast forth, as Ovid informs us in his Fasti. Until the Terinthian came into these lands, gloomy sacrifices were annually offered in the Leucadian manner. He threw into the water Romans made of straw. Do you, after the example of Hercules, cast in the images of human bodies? The Vestal virgins make these sacred offerings, as the same poet says. Then also a virgin is accustomed to cast from the wooden bridge the images of ancient men made from rushes. For I cannot find language to speak of the infants who were immolated to the same Saturn on account of his hatred of Jupiter. To think that men were so barbarous, so savage, that they gave the name of sacrifice to the slaughter of their own children, that is, to a deed foul, and to be held in detestation by the human race. Since, without any regard to parental affection, they destroyed tender and innocent lives at an age which is especially pleasing to parents, and surpassed in brutality the savageness of all beasts, which, savage as they are, still love their offspring. O incurable madness! What more could those gods do to them if they were most angry than they now do when propitious, when they defile their worshippers with parricide, visit them with bereavements, and deprive them of the sensibilities of men? What can be sacred to these men? Or what will they do in profane places who commit the greatest crimes amidst the altars of the gods? Pescennius Festus relates in the books of his history by a satire that the Carthaginians were accustomed to immolate human victims to Saturn, and when they were conquered by Agathocles, the king of the Sicilians, they imagined that the god was angry with them, and therefore, that they might more diligently offer an expiation, they immolated 200 sons of their nobles. So great the ills to which religion could prompt, which has oft-times produced wicked and impious deeds. What advantage, then, did the men propose by that sacrifice, when they put to death so large a part of the state, as not even Agathocles had slain when victorious? From this kind of sacrifices, those public rites are to be judged signs of no less madness, some of which are in honor of the mother of the gods, in which men mutilate themselves. Others are in honor of Virtus, whom they also call Bellona, in which the priests make offspring not with the blood of another victim, but with their own. For, cutting their shoulders and thrusting forth drawn swords in each hand, they run, they are beside themselves, they are frantic. Quintilian therefore says excellently in his Fanatic, if a god compels this, he does it in anger. Are even these things sacred? Is it not better to live like cattle than to worship deities so impious, profane, and sanguinary? But we will discuss at the proper time the source from which these errors and deeds of such great disgrace originated. In the meantime, let us look also to other matters which are without guilt, that we may not seem to select the worse parts through the desire of finding fault. In Egypt, there are sacred rites in honor of Isis, since she either lost or found her little son. For at first, her priests, having made their bodies smooth, beat their breasts and lament as the goddess herself had done when her child was lost. Afterwards, the boy is brought forward as if found, and that mourning is changed into joy. Therefore Lucan says, and Osiris never sufficiently sought for they always lose, and they always find him. Therefore in the sacred rites there is a representation of a circumstance which really occurred, and which assuredly declares, if we have any intelligence, that she was a mortal woman and almost desolate, had she not found one person. And this did not escape the notice of the poet himself, for he represents Pompey when a youth is thus speaking on hearing the death of his father, I will now draw forth the deity Isis from the tomb and send her through the nations, and I will scatter through the people Osiris covered with wood. This Osiris is the same whom the people call Serapis, for it is customary for the names of the dead who are deified to be changed, that no one, as I believe, may imagine them to be men. For Romulus, after his death, became Quirinus, and Leda became Nemesis, and Circe Marica. And Ino, when she had leapt into the sea, was called Leucothea, and the mother Matuta, and her son Melicerta was called Palemon and Portumnus. And the sacred rites of the Eleusinian series are not unlike these. For as in those which have been mentioned, the boy Osiris is sought with the wailing of his mother, so in these Proserpine is carried away to contract an incestuous marriage with her uncle. And because Ceres is said to have sought for her in Sicily with torches lighted from the top of Etna, On this account, her sacred rites are celebrated with the throwing of torches. At Lampsacus, the victim to be offered to Priapus is an ass, and the cause of the sacrifice of this animal is thus set forth in the Fasti. When all the deities had assembled at the festival of the Great Mother, and when, satiated with feasting, they were spending the night in sport, they say that Vesta had laid herself on the ground for rest and had fallen asleep, and that Priapus upon this formed a design against her honor as she slept, but that she was aroused by the unseasonable braying of the ass on which Silenus used to ride, and that the design of the insidious plotter was frustrated. On this account, they say that the people of Lampsacus were accustomed to sacrifice an ass to Priapus, as though it were in revenge. But among the Romans, the same animal was crowned at the Vestalia, festival of Vesta, with loaves, in honor of the preservation of her chastity. What is baser, what more disgraceful, than if Vesta is indebted to an ass for the preservation of her purity? But the poet invented a fable. But was that more true which is related by those who wrote Phenomena, when they speak concerning the 2 stars of Cancer, which the Greeks call asses? That they were asses which carried across Father Liber when he was unable to cross a river, and that he rewarded one of them with the power of speaking with human voice, and that a contest arose between him and Priapus. And Priapus, being worsted in the contest, was enraged and slew the victor. This truly is much more absurd, but poets have the license of saying what they will. I do not meddle with a mystery so odious, nor do I strip Priapus of his disguise, lest something deserving of ridicule should be brought to light. It is true the poets invented these fictions, but they must have been invented for the purpose of concealing some greater depravity. Let us inquire what this is. But in fact, it is evident. For as the bull is sacrificed to Luna, because he also has horns as she has, and as Persia propitiates with a horse Hyperion surrounded with rays, that a slow victim may not be offered to the swift god, so in this case no more suitable victim could be found than that which resembled him to whom it is offered. At Lindus, which is a town of Rhodes, there are sacred rites in honor of Hercules, the observance of which differs widely from all other rites, for they are not celebrated with words of good omen, as the Greeks term it, but with revilings and cursing. And they consider it a violation of the sacred rites if at any time during the celebration of the solemnities a good word shall have escaped from anyone even inadvertently. And this is the reason assigned for this practice, if indeed there can be any reason in things utterly senseless. When Hercules had arrived at the place and was suffering hunger, he saw a ploughman at work and began to ask him to sell one of his oxen. But the ploughman replied that this was impossible, because his hope of cultivating the land depended altogether upon those 2 bullocks. Hercules, with his usual violence, because he was not able to receive one of them, killed both. But the unhappy man, when he saw that his oxen were slain, avenged the injury with reviling, a circumstance which afforded gratification to the man of elegance and refinement. For while he prepares a feast for his companions, and while he devours the oxen of another man, he receives with ridicule and loud laughter the bitter reproaches with which the other assails him. But when it had been determined that divine honors should be paid to Hercules in admiration of his excellence, an altar was erected in his honor by the citizens, which he named from the circumstance the yoke of oxen. And at this altar 2 yoked oxen were sacrificed, like those which he had taken from the ploughman. And he appointed the same man to be his priest, and directed him always to use the same reviling in offering sacrifice, because he said that he had never feasted more pleasantly. Now these things are not sacred, but sacrilegious, in which that is said to be enjoined, which if it is done in other things, is punished with the greatest severity. What, moreover, do the rites of the Cretan Jupiter himself show, except the manner in which he was withdrawn from his father, or brought up? There is a goat belonging to the nymph Amalthea, which gave suck to the infant, and of this goat Germanicus Caesar thus speaks in his poem translated from Aratus: "She is supposed to be the nurse of Jupiter, if in truth the infant Jupiter pressed the faithful teats of the Cretan goat, which attests the gratitude of her lord by a bright constellation." Musaeus relates that Jupiter, when fighting against the Titans, used the hide of this goat as a shield, from which circumstance he is called by the poets shield-bearer. Thus, whatever was done in concealing the boy, that also is done by way of representation in the sacred rites. Moreover, the mystery of his mother also contains the same story which Ovid sets forth in the Fasti. Now the lofty Ida resounds with tinkling, that the boy may cry in safety with infant mouth. Some strike their shields with stakes, some beat their empty helmets. This is the employment of the curetes, this of the corybantes. The matter was concealed, and imitations of the ancient deed remain. The attendant goddesses shake instruments of brass and horse hides. Instead of helmets, they strike cymbals, and drums instead of shields. The flute gives Phrygian strains, as it gave before. Sallust rejected this opinion altogether, as though invented by the poets, and wished to give an ingenious explanation of the reasons for which the curetes are said to have nourished Jupiter, and he speaks to this purport: "Because they were the first to understand the worship of the deity, that therefore antiquity, which exaggerates all things, made them known as the nourishers of Jupiter. How much this learned man was mistaken, the matter itself at once declares. For if Jupiter holds the first place, both among the gods and in religious rites, if no gods were worshipped by the people before him, because they who are worshipped were not yet born, it appears that the curetes, on the contrary, were the first who did not understand the worship of the deity, since all error was introduced by them, and the memory of the true God was taken away. They ought therefore to have understood from the mysteries and ceremonies themselves that they were offering prayers to dead men. I do not then require that anyone should believe the fictions of the poets. If anyone imagines that these speak falsely, let him consider the writings of the pontiffs themselves, and weigh whatever there is of literature pertaining to sacred rites. He will perhaps find more things than we bring forward, from which he may understand that all things which are esteemed sacred are empty, vain, and fictitious. But if anyone, having discovered wisdom, shall lay aside his error, he will assuredly laugh at the follies of men who are almost without understanding. I mean those who either dance with unbecoming gestures, or run naked, anointed, and crowned with chaplets, either wearing a mask or besmeared with mud. What shall I say about shields now putrid with age? When they carry these, they think that they are carrying gods themselves on their shoulders. For Furius Bibaculus is regarded among the chief examples of piety, who, though he was praetor, nevertheless carried the sacred shield, preceded by the lictors, though his office as praetor gave him an exemption from this duty. He was therefore not furious, but altogether mad, who thought that he graced his praetorship by this service. Deservedly then, since these things are done by men not unskillful and ignorant, does Lucretius exclaim, "O foolish minds of men, O blinded breasts, in what darkness of life and in how great dangers is passed this term of life, whatever be its duration." Who that is possessed of any sense would not laugh at these mockeries when he sees that men, as though bereft of intelligence, do those things seriously, which if anyone should do in sport, he would appear too full of sport and folly. The author and establisher of these vanities among the Romans was that Sabine king who especially engaged the rude and ignorant minds of men with new superstitions, and that he might do this with some authority, he pretended that he had meetings by night with the goddess Egeria. There was a very dark cavern in the grove of Aricia, from which flowed a stream with a never-failing spring. Hither he was accustomed to withdraw himself without any witnesses, that he might be able to pretend that by the admonition of the goddess his wife, he delivered to the people those sacred rites which were most acceptable to the gods. It is evident that he wished to imitate the craftiness of Minos, who concealed himself in the cave of Jupiter, and after a long delay there, brought forward laws, as though delivered to him by Jupiter, that he might bind men to obedience not only by the authority of his government, but also by the sanction of religion. Nor was it difficult to persuade shepherds. Therefore he instituted pontiffs, priests, salii, and augurs. He arranged the gods in families, and by these means he softened the fierce spirits of the new people and called them away from warlike affairs to the pursuit of peace. But though he deceived others, he did not deceive himself. For after many years, in the consulship of Cornelius and Bebius, in a field belonging to the scribe Petilius, under the Janiculum, 2 stone chests were found by men who were digging, in one of which was the body of Numa, in the other 7 books in Latin respecting the law of the pontiffs, and the same number written in Greek respecting systems of philosophy, in which he not only annulled the religious rites which he himself had instituted, but all others also. When this was referred to the Senate, it was decreed that these books should be destroyed. Therefore, Quintus Petilius, the praetor who had jurisdiction in the city, burnt them in an assembly of the people. This was a senseless proceeding, for of what advantage was it that the books were burnt when the cause on account of which they were burnt, that they took away the authority due to religion, was itself handed down to memory? Everyone then in the Senate was most foolish, for the books might have been burnt, and yet the matter itself have been unknown. Thus, while they wished to prove even to posterity with what piety they defended religious institutions, they lessened the authority of the institutions themselves by their testimony. But as Pompilius was the institutor of foolish superstitions among the Romans, so also, before Pompilius, Faunus was in Latium, who both established impious rites to his grandfather Saturnus, and honored his father Picus with a place among the gods, and consecrated his sister Fatua Fauna, who was also his wife, who, as Gabius Bassus relates, was called Fatua because she had been in the habit of foretelling their fates to women, as Faunus did to men. And Varro writes that she was a woman of such great modesty that as long as she lived, no male except her husband saw her or heard her name. On this account, women sacrifice to her in secret and call her the good goddess. And Sextus Claudius, in that book which he wrote in Greek, relates that it was the wife of Faunus, who, because contrary to the practice and honor of kings, she had drunk a jar of wine and had become intoxicated, was beaten to death by her husband with myrtle rods. But afterwards, when he was sorry for what he had done, and was unable to endure his regret for her, he paid her divine honors. For this reason, they say that a covered jar of wine is placed at her sacred rites. Therefore Faunus also left to posterity no slight error, which all that are intelligent see through. For Lucilius in these verses derides the folly of those who imagine that images are gods. The terrestrial lamia, which Faunus and Numa Pompilius and others instituted, at and these he trembles, he places everything in this. As infant boys believe that every statue of bronze is a living man, so these imagine that all things feigned are true. They believe that statues of bronze contain a heart. It is a painter's gallery. There is nothing true. All things are fictitious. The poet indeed compares foolish men to infants, but I say that they are much more senseless than infants. For they, infants, suppose that images are men, whereas these take them for gods. The one through their age, the others through folly, imagine that which is not true. At any rate, the one soon ceased to be deceived. The foolishness of the others is permanent and always increases. Orpheus was the first to introduce the rites of Father Liber into Greece, and he first celebrated them on a mountain of Boeotia, very near to Thebes, where Liber was born. And because this mountain continually resounded with the strains of the lyre, it was called Cytheron. Those sacred rites are even now called Orphic, in which he himself was lacerated and torn in pieces, and he lived about the same time with Faunus. But which of them was prior in age admits of doubt, since Latinus and Priam reigned during the same years, as did also their fathers Faunus and Laomedon, in whose reign Orpheus came with the Argonauts to the coast of the Trojans. Let us therefore advance further and inquire who was really the first author of the worship of the gods. Didymus, in the books of his commentary on Pindar, says that Melesius, king of the Cretans, was the first who sacrificed to the gods and introduced new rites and parades of sacrifices. He had two daughters, Amalthea and Melissa, who nourished the youthful Jupiter with goat's milk and honey. Hence that poetic fable derived its origin, that bees flew to the child and filled his mouth with honey. Moreover, he says that Melissa was appointed by her father the first priestess of the Great Mother, from which circumstance the priests of the same mother are still called Melissae. But the sacred history testifies that Jupiter himself, when he had gained possession of power, arrived at such insolence that he built temples in honor of himself in many places. For when he went about to different lands, on his arrival in each region, he united to himself the kings or princes of the people in hospitality and friendship. And when he was departing from each, he ordered that a shrine should be dedicated to himself in the name of his host, as though the remembrance of their friendship and league could thus be preserved. Thus, temples were founded in honor of Jupiter Attaberius and Jupiter Labrandius. For Attaberius and Labrandius were his entertainers and assistants in war. Temples were also built to Jupiter Laprius, to Jupiter Molion, to Jupiter Cassius, and others, after the same manner. This was a very crafty device on his part, that he might both acquire divine honor for himself and a perpetual name for his entertainers in conjunction with religious observances. Accordingly, they were glad and cheerfully submitted to his command, and observed annual rites and festivals for the sake of handing down their own name. Aeneas did something like this in Sicily when he gave the name of his host, Acestes, to a city which he had built, that Acestes might afterwards joyfully and willingly love, increase, and adorn it. In this manner, Jupiter spread abroad through the world the observance of his worship, and gave an example for the imitation of others. Whether then the practice of worshipping the gods proceeded from Melesius, as Didymus related, or from Jupiter also himself, as Euhemerus says, the time is still agreed upon when the gods began to be worshipped. Melesius indeed was much prior in time, inasmuch as he brought up Jupiter, his grandson. It is therefore possible that either before or while Jupiter was yet a boy, he taught the worship of the gods, namely the mother of his foster child, and his grandmother Tellus, who was the wife of Uranus, and his father Saturnus, and he himself, by this example and institution, may have exalted Jupiter to such pride that he afterwards ventured to assume divine honors to himself. Now, since we have ascertained the origin of vain superstitions, it remains that we should also collect the times during which they whose memory is honored lived. Theophilus, in his book written to Autolycus respecting the times, says that Thallus relates in his history that Belus, who is worshipped by the Babylonians and Assyrians, is found to have lived 322 years before the Trojan War. That Belus, moreover, was contemporary with Saturnus, and that they both grew up at one time, which is so true that it may be inferred by reason itself. For Agamemnon, who carried on the Trojan War, was the fourth in descent from Jupiter, and Achilles and Ajax were of the third descent from him, and Ulysses was related in the same degree. Priam, indeed, was distant by a long series of descents. But according to some authorities, Dardanus and Iaseus were sons of Coritus, not of Jupiter. For if it had been so, Jupiter could not have formed that unchaste connection with Ganymede, his own descendant. Therefore, if you divide the years which are in agreement, the number will be found in harmony with the parents of those whom I have named above. Now, from the destruction of the Trojan city, 1470 years are made up. From this calculation of times, it is manifest that Saturnus has not been born more than 1800 years, and he also was the father of all the gods. Let them not glory, then, in the antiquity of their sacred rites, since both their origin and system and times have been ascertained. There still remain some things which may be of great weight for the disproving of false religions, but I have determined now to bring this book to an end, that it may not exceed moderate limits. For those things must be followed up more fully, that having refuted all things which seem to oppose the truth, we may be able to instruct in true religion men who, through ignorance of good things, wander in uncertainty. But the first step towards wisdom is to understand what is false. The second, to ascertain what is true. Therefore, he who shall have profited by this first discussion of mine, in which we have exposed false things, will be excited to the knowledge of the truth, than which no pleasure is more gratifying to man. And he will now be worthy of the wisdom of heavenly training, who shall approach with willingness and preparation to the knowledge of the other subjects.